Chapter The Fire. Page 18. Meg explained one night at the fire. Dreams get caught in the webs woven in our bones. That's where they live, in that marrow there. He poked at the crackling wood with a pointy stick, till the shadows were frenetic against his tan face, till they slid into longer shoots of hair near the front of his mohawk. The tendrils he swept up and patted into place atop the shorter brush with the care of a pageant queen. He didn't make eye contact with us, the motley group seated in a loose semicircle around the fire, beneath the trees where he commanded place. I imagined spiderwebs in my bones and turned my palm towards the moon, watching the ballet of bones between my elbow and wrist twist to make it so. I saw webs clouded with dreams like fat flies. I wonder if the horses I'd ridden into this dawn were still caught in there like bugs, whinnying at the shift. Mig nudged the rounded stones placed around the perimeter of the fire with his boot. You could see where the holes in his sole had been patched up with sap and scavenged leather. How did they get in there? Riri, now 7, was always curious and not shy with her questions. You are born with them. Your DNA weaves them into the marrow like spinners, Mega answered. The flames tried to settle, and he prodded them to dance again. He added, That's where they plucked them from. I pulled each one of my fingers into my palm and made it a fist silhouetted against the fire, flames licking around the tight ball of brown and bone. I imagined my brother, tied to a chair at the school, a flock of gray-hooded villains tightening his beaded chains while they recited Hail Mary like synchronized swimmers. Mig sat, satisfied that we were all at attention, that we were listening with every cell. He leaned against a felled tree beside Minerva, who woke up with his rustling. He rolled the smoke out his precious tobacco stores and plucked a twig out of the fire with a burning ember at the tip to light it with. Old Minerva, nearsighted to squinting, lifted her nose at the smell. Her lips fell slack and she sighed. Those first few inhales were big and wasteful as Mig tried to get the damp paper to light, and smoke billowed across the clearing like messages. Everything was always damp, so we were trained to sniff out mold to keep the sickness at bay. Minerva made her hands into shallow cups and pulled the air over her head and face, making prayers out of ashes and smoke. Real old-timey, that Minerva. Mig and Minerva were the only grown-ups in our group. Mig wore his hair shaved to the skull, except down the middle, and had a mustache that only grew on the left side of his top lip. The hell? He was tall but bent like a walking question mark. Damn, scoliosis. And he was short with words and patience. Mig wore army pants, alternating between two identical pairs and layers of brown and green sweaters. He kept a small pouch hung on a shoelace around his neck and tucked into those sweaters. Once, when I'd asked him, he told me that's where he kept his heart, because it was too dangerous to keep it in his chest. What with the sharp edges of bone so easily broken? I never asked again. Too many metaphors of stories wrapped in stories. It could be exhausting talking to Mig. Minerva was dark, round, and tiny like a tree stump. She kept her long gray hair in 2 braids like a little girl with a flowered kerchief tied around her head and under her round chin. She had old-timey ways, but you couldn't get much from her, either. She didn't talk, and when she did, it was in bursts accompanied by laughter and maybe a scream or two. She crazy. Mostly she watched. Everything. Us kids playing in the river, the ways the trees tilted to the north towards what was left of the natural landscape beyond the clear-cut strip of topsoil. She watched the birds on their perpetual migration to anywhere, the fire at the end of the day, and the way we clapped each other's backs when trading off on the trap lines. There were 7 of us in the group, 5 boys and 2 girls, not including the elders. Not one of us was related by blood, which was a good thing for those closer in age, since in the old days when our families were huge and sprawling, accidentally dating a second or third cousin had meant you had asked about genealogy right off the bat. Sweet home Alabama. But it was also lonely, not having the common connection of grandparents or aunties like we used to have so often. There was Chi-Boy, who at 17 was the oldest boy and taller than anyone else. He was a quiet, almost to the point of being mute and as skinny as a doe. He never seemed to sleep as long as the rest of us or need as much food. And he stuck close to Mig so that when he was needed, he was no more than one syllable away. He came from the west, from the Cree lands. After Chi-Boy, there was me, 16. I was nicknamed Frenchie as much for my name as for my people, the Métis. I came from a long line of hunters, trappers, and voyagers. But now, with most of the rivers cut into pieces and lakes left as gray sludge puckers on the landscape, my own history seemed like a myth along the lines of dragons. Compared to Chi-Boy's 6+ feet, I wasn't the tallest, but I did have the longest hair of any of the boys, almost to my waist. Burnt ombre at the untrimmed edges. I braided it myself each morning to keep it out of the way and to remind myself of things I couldn't quite remember, but that, nevertheless, I knew to be true. My clothes were also burnt from the sun and wear, a mottled brown from the original tones of black. Then there were the 12-year-old twins, Tree and Ziguan, whose matched green eyes communicated without words between them. They were broader than the rest of us, with wide shoulders and heavy hands that hung from ropey arms. They were dotted with scars I couldn't bring myself to ask about. They shared one baseball cap between the two of them. They got small heads. Changing from head to head one day to the next. Slopper was next, the 9-year-old with the belly of a 50-year-old diabetic? Damn. His family came from the East Coast. The girls had Wab, who at 18 was practically a woman. She had a vicious keloid, I thought it said Kool-Aid, slash that split her face nearly in two. Then there was Riri, who came from a Métis community close to where my father had said ours used to be, who was old enough to piss in the bush and swear when we played red ass on abandoned brick walls, who was still a child. Us kids, we longed for the old-timey. We wore our hair in braids to show it. We made sweat lodges out of broken branches, dug back into the earth, covered over with our shirts, and tied together at the buttonholes. Those lodges weren't very hot, but we sat in them for hours and willed the sweat to pop over our willowy arms and hairless cheeks. It's time for story. Mig exhaled smoke as he spoke. I watched the word story puff over the fire and spread into a cumulative haze that smelled of ground roots and acrid burn just above our dark heads. Slopper struggled to his feet and started over to his tent. The youngest weren't privy to story. Not yet, anyway. Riri made the face she pulled out when she wanted something, like an extra piece of camp bread or to sleep in my tent so I could tell her stories to keep the nightmares away. Mig just looked at her, lifting one eyebrow higher than the other, like the rock. Ah, Mig, can I stay for a little bit? She received no answer and kicked rocks all the way to her tent. The woods grew quiet now. Even the beetles stopped rubbing their smooth shells on softened bark. Even the wind picked around the branches instead of rattling straight through. Mig leaned in so that the fire illuminated his face from the button-like unsteady stage lights. And he opened a hand, palm down to indicate the ground, this ground, as he began story.